thank you again for coming today to today's talk, which is part of our 2024-25 public events series, Key Passages. And throughout the year, speakers in the series have been exploring life-changing transitions and cultural formations, as well as textual passages, musical compositions, and works of visual culture that have opened new directions in artistic fields and energized political activity. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Chumash people, who are the traditional custodians of the land upon which the Interdisciplinary Humanities Center is located, and I would like to pay respect to elders, both past and present. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Claudio E. Benzecry. Professor Benzecry is a faculty member in the Department of Communication Studies and Sociology at Northwestern University, where he teaches and researches in the areas of sociology of the arts, cultural production, Latin America, and globalization. He earned his PhD in sociology at NYU and has taught at the University of Connecticut before he joined the Northwestern faculty in 2015. He's the author of 2 books, The Opera Fanatic, Ethnography of an Obsession, which received numerous awards and recognitions, including the Mary Douglas Award for the best book in the sociology of culture. His second book, The Perfect Fit, Creative Work in the Global Shoe Industry, opens an ethnographic window onto the lives of those who create shoe samples and prototypes. Professor Benzecry has also edited 4 volumes on theory, culture, and knowledge, including Social Theory Now, and published articles in those areas in leading journals, including Sociological Theory and Theory and Society. And I edited out 13 mentions of the words sociology and theory for this little introduction. Since 2019, he has served as co-editor-in-chief of the journal Qualitative Sociology, which is actually really wonderful. Currently, Professor Benzecry is working on 3 manuscripts, including one in Spanish, on how to validate, write, and justify qualitative data, and another ethnographic study of arts custodians in New York City museums and galleries. Today, he will be presenting his newest research to us in a talk entitled Subjects or Objects, Key Passageways Between Things and Humans. Please join me in welcoming Professor Benzecry. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi. How you doing? Welcome. I want to start by thanking Susan for the invitation and Christopher there, Andrew Dinner for suggesting probably that I be here. And also I'm really happy to be here. I would say 3 of my favorite sociologists at different points in time were here. 2 are actually in the audience. One is Harvey Moloch, the other one is Andrew, and the other one is Hannah Wall, who's currently on maternal leave and was one of our students at Northwestern. The talk I'm going to be giving today is the first time I give it, so bear with me. It's more like an open invitation to a conversation. What I'm going to be trying to do is think through the 3 projects and different ways in which humans and things are thought of as subjects or objects, and what does that mean. And I'm really happy to be in a humanities interdisciplinary center. I would say I'm inspired by big humanity questions, but I try to bring to them more of a sociological empiricist eye to them. So I'm going to try to play between the 2 a little bit. So this was a show of a quilt artist, Bisa Butler, at the Chicago Art Institute in 2021. And so the thing that captured my imagination when I went to, the exhibit is amazing, but it was the first time that I was in a museum where the guards were welcoming the audience as if they actually were the people in charge of the exhibition. And part of it, of course, had to do with what kind of populations tend to be museum guards, at least in MoMA and in the Art Institute of Chicago, and how much they seem to present this as an experience of joy, of expertise, and of belonging, where the museum was their home. This, as you know, is a very unlike experience. Museum guards are supposed to be on the background, and so that sort of inspired me to think of, well, why are they on the background, and what does it mean to be on the background? And that was like the beginning of the exploration. When I started doing fieldwork at MoMA, I witnessed kind of the same thing. This is a BR work of art. So of course, Toussaint Louverture is not at Columbus Circle right now in New York. It's just a projection on Columbus. And there were other works of art that including The Young Lords, Shirley Chisholm, Seneca Village. And the thing that made me start thinking, and that's hence the connection with the book on the opera fans, is how is it that in a place where things become subjects, people have to work hard to become objects, right? And that sort of tension between the two. And in this case, that their subjectivity is only tied to the function they perform, fulfill. In the place where we celebrate, to quote art historian David Joselli, the experiential inexhaustibility, of the art, its impossible fixity and consumption, we actually see here people that are put into particular subject positions and object positions. And so the big, I would say, humanities question came from the work of Jacques Rancière, where he's, after his book, and I think in English is The Disagreement, right? He has this conversation on the idea of the partition of the sensible and the perceptible, which is in different aesthetic regimes, the question of what is and is not visible, audible, comprehensible within a particular aesthetic regime, which allows us to see whether an enunciation is heard as speech or instead as noise, and how visibility, speech, roles are distributed in society, essentially determining who can see, say, or do. And that, it's, I would say, the research question, if there's something like that in this project, of what and who counts, and how do we see this in different art worlds, right? That question of who, what is a subject, who, what is an object. And so the invitation was a provocation to think of the term passages, actually, and think of the different transitions between one and the other, and to ask the question under which conditions are humans made to occupy subject or object positions. And so I'm inspired by different traditions that have to do with trajectories of subjectification and objectification. And so I'm in conversation with, and in that way I would say I'm very eclectic and almost promiscuous, processual accounts of commodity chains and object biography, the idea that you have to think of an object as a career and the different valuation regimes under which they can be qualified. Questions like when and how are object commodities, when are they decommodified, when does a thing become an object, when are they docile or unruly. From STS and infrastructure work, sorry, I'm trying, there you go, well, to see my notes, but I'll go winging it. From STS, the question on how standards allowed and constrain action in different ways, how infrastructure, again, have like different roles, including the idea of invisible labor, and the Stephen Shaping recent work on the science of subjectivity. And from material cultural sociology, let me see something. I want to see my notes. There you go. I've been inspired by work that has explored objects' role in affording and constraining particular lines of action, like the work of Harvey Moloch, the extent to which objects are docile or unruly in the interaction with the infrastructure they generate, the intersection of multiple expert and non-expert accumulated kinds of material knowledge necessary for the construction of an infrastructure, and my own previous work on how selfhood and particular versions of an object becomes intertwined over time. I also have been revisiting sort of the classic Everett Hughes inspired sociology of work with concepts like dirty work, shit work, invisible labor that are part of that literature. And even though most people would say these people are not in the same conversation, for me they are. They all have an emphasis on mundane activity, on how coordination is possible, how interaction is always mediated instead of immediate, and how materiality plays a particular kind of role in this. Since this is like, there you go. 3 different projects at once. I'm not gonna really talk about my methods. I'm just gonna say the 3 things that I did differently for each project. That's a picture of the Cologne Opera House, the highest floor where people go in standing room. And like other places in the world, almost 20 to 25% of the seats on a night are actually people who are in the standing room. So it is a particular fruitful place to study this. I did this partially, again, as an inversion between what usually gets studied, right? The idea that opera is this fancy, elitist, exclusionary thing on the one hand, but also to see the secondary trace. You know, how can you study consumption? How can you understand what is it that like people do, how they attach themselves, what techniques they use to become one with the music? In the second project, and you're going to see this, is an infrastructural inversion. I talk about globalization, I talk about infrastructures, I talk about huge things, but I'm focusing on the foot of the feet model. So it's an inversion. I'm seeing the global through like the most minuscule thing that you can see how it enters into a relationship. And in the case of the main project, which is absolutely new, it's the first time I talk in public about this, so we see how it goes, the idea of backgrounding, the idea of putting people who are on the background at the center of the scene. In some ways, similar to the infrastructural inversion, it's just like in this case, I didn't call it infrastructure in the same way. So this book came out a bunch of years ago, et cetera, et cetera. And in one of the first interviews from my fieldwork, you know, I was going to do something very classic, Bourdieu is wrong, and I'm gonna show you how for Argentina it doesn't apply. And then it turned out that the more I did participant observation and the more I talked to people, they were like, you know, who cares about all your questions? Why don't you find out how we love this and why we love it, right? And so that became sort of the orienting frame and the orienting question of this project. And so my idea for the book was, you know, what would happen if we would take this comment on love as literally as we can? What would entail to take seriously as a frame for analysis? What kind of social form would this love be? And what I mean by love in this case is a sort of intense personalized investment fans charge opera with. The object cathexis it produces. Authors such as Simmel back in the day and Enyon relatively contemporarily have elucidated the shape and the content of this kind of attachment. Enyon did so by pointing out the middle forms of reflexivity, usually written in passive voice, especially in Romance languages, that express a peculiar mode of being subject to something, where things are experienced or listened to. Simmel similarly discusses the monogamous marriage as a social form in which the social agents transcend themselves through a decision that paradoxically negates their own character as autonomous people, right? Giving themselves away to someone, or in this case, to something. The new figure, subsumes, dissolves, cancels what we consider the individual and creates a new configuration which is linked to both parts from the get-go, impossible to divide. And for those of you asking what that question is, that's actually someone standing on top of, almost like at the beginning of he didn't jump in case someone is like worried about those things. He was just, I think, very taken. And if you ever look at the book, you're going to see people who do all kind of like different things with spatial practices on that little space to be able to see and experience the opera in this particular way. And so one of the ways in which we can think of this is like the language of opera attendance resembles that of an addiction, right? And you get to see, I'm not going to read every testimony, but as you can see, the idea of each and every one of these testimonies is that basically that opera is something that is too much. And so taste appears here as this particular kind of activity that becomes all-encompassing for those involved with it. This style of intense affiliation results in the momentary dissolution of the self produced by a series of effects. an aria, a particular singer, a particular passage. Usually nothing instrumental, I would say, but and what we get to see, is people that invest themselves in an active discipline full of constraints and special knowledge that allows them to forget about themselves or let themselves go. The interesting thing about these techniques is that if I tell you something like I go to the opera, you'll be like, oh, great, amazing. If I tell you, well, I kind of go 2 or 3 times a week, you will look at me like, oh, why? What are you doing, right? And you will most likely think to me, going to the opera is each and every time the same thing, but each and every time is a different experience. And by that I mean opera appears as that field of micro differences made of minutiae, multi-detail activities, and venues, like I said, where the outsider, the phrase, I go to the opera, is one particular thing. For someone like the addict, the phrase stands in for many things: attending the premiere of a never-seen-before title at the main opera house, attending the second performance of the same title to compare the performances and the reaction it elicited on themselves once the novelty powered by the piece or the opening night has waned, attending a recital of a tenor arias with a younger singer and a pianist, attending a second title, this time in a secondary opera house, to check a local soloist who does not get to perform in stellar roles at the Colón, attending a third performance of the main title in the main opera house before mentioned to see the second cast of soloists, going to the movie theater to shows the Met or the Covent Garden, there you go, or the Covent Garden, this is the movie, there you go, I got that. In high definition, attending a second performance of the opera as a secondary stage, as to focus this time on the passages the soloist had excelled at this moment, interested in enjoying and analyzing, and so on and so forth. Like I said, the literature sort of emphasizes the active work of preparation required to achieve a high, right? In this case, a musical one. Sometimes, however, this intense preparation is displaced by an even higher musical fix, the moment of surprise. Since these fans are so prepared for most opera, they spend much of the time during a performance thinking about the few moments during which they can achieve that high, or how much they prefer the CV version they have, or how much more interesting the last staging was, or how the voice of the soprano is better suited for a different repertoire. The surprise, a rarely performer or never recorded opera, a contemporary work they've been wary of, a forgotten or long overdue piece, allows them to enjoy the show 100% without worrying about any ghost. Right? And so I want to stop here for a second and think this of like the first case of tension between what's a subject and what's an object that I call paradoxical agency, right? In this case, a person that actively works on themselves to make themselves passive, to attach itself to the agency power of, what would a priori consider an object, right? The opera and its sounds. A lot of the idea of thinking about this is like, what is it that the work of art affords, and what kind of techniques, like the ones I described, either the intense preparation or the not knowing anything to be surprised, are ways of working through that particular kind of attachment that produces. And then the fact that, like I mentioned before, there's a paradoxical kind of agency that exists in order to work on the dissolution of the autonomy of the self. So this is case one, if we want to be very comparative sociologists. This is the latest book that is about not so much factory work, partially because it's been overly done. And like I always say, if you look at all your tags, I bet you they still say Myanmar, Nicaragua, China, all the places where it produced, even though we read and seen like, I don't know how many documentaries decrying the conditions of production. But most people have not studied why these things are not only made cheap but beautiful. Why would you want to buy something that costs $60? Well, because it resembles the same thing that costs $300, right? And people tend not to study and overlook that. And so in looking at this, everything that goes before the factory, I look at design and development, which means I look at design offices, sample rooms, in between New York, South China, South Brazil. And what you get to see when you do that is that things are still done as a craft. The question, though, is how do you do a craft when there's no face-to-face interaction? How do you do a craft when all of the knowledge transmission is usually informal, kinesthetic, embodied, corporal knowledge? And so, as you're going to see, the project was an attempt to think of how is it that knowledge that is like this can actually be formalized, reproduced, and restored in between multiple contexts. And in order to talk about this, sorry, I have too many buttons to touch, so I'm going a little bit crazy. I had to do a lot of also online ethnography very early on to understand what was going on, because this wasn't the kind of project where you would be in a room for a long time and would make sense of it. People were looking at screens, like listening to something on their headphones and sending each other photos and files. So at some point, in order to understand what was going on, I asked if I could start seeing some of the communication. That was before I ended up going to China to live there every June and December for 3 years to do this project. And, why should we care if Anna is busy? Anna is a fit girl, which is basically the person that works putting the foot in order for the samples to be adjusted, changed, and eventually confirmed before they're developed into the final product in the factory, right? So even though this is a very minor secondary character, what I'm going to try to show is that it's central to this particular structure, to this particular infrastructure, right? And so food models, like the one here, are stabilizing actors. In order to guarantee that the designers know the materials and the design react when shoes are worn, the sample room, they all have a fit girl that tries on the shoe. The standardization of that is such that when the fit girl of this particular sample room is busy with some other brand, the office manager has to let the designer know that what they're looking at in the picture is the foot of another model. And I'm going to explain why this is the case and why it matters. Anna's absence is what, like Bruno Latour would call a tiny barrier, right? Like something that modifies, even though it's small, a particular network of action. The food stabilization, like I said, allows for designers, technicians, production managers in both sides of the world to be sure what they're looking at when they receive a sheet with measurements or an image with a prototype or a sample being tried on. This is a less obvious technical device through which procedures are black box, simplified, settled at a distance. Oopsie. That one is not going, probably because I touched too many things. There you go. So what's in a foot? I know it sounds like a very philosophical question. The name of this fit model is Arlene. She's American. She puts her right foot on the table. Next to her sits Clint, a veteran technician in his 70s, has been working in the industry for 50 years. My presence gives them an excuse to take a break and for Clint to make explicit what from a foot matters in shoemaking. For outsiders like me, and that's the question I always get, why do you need a person? Especially now, can you do like a 3D printing, AI-generated thing that's gonna, they can use wooden or rubber mannequins or the last itself in order to measure how the shoe is coming out. And they say the answer is pretty obvious. While the last manages to give you volume, it's a rigid object. On the other hand, the foot is malleable and gives you a lot of information, including the information that's given by the woman that owns the foot, right? But desirable affordances can be entangled with other kind of challenges. In this case, how to account for the quirks of a foot that is supposed to be standard. This foot, for this particular set of brands, is supposed to be a stand-in for every foot and for a base that's going to generate the last that's going to be at the center of the design. It's usually an object of its own that renders through its imperfections more useful information than it was just the solid and perfect three-dimensional representation of what designers had dreamed. When working on the foot from Arlene they use, usually the industry works on the right foot. both feet are different, which is something I only learned by doing this fieldwork. Clint is constantly on the lookout for two different things, and you can see how, that's a perfect, not perfect foot, right? The first one is that her foot overpronates, so the weight of it rolls inward, and she tends to push off almost completely from the big toe and the second toe. The second one is that her second toe is actually longer than her big toe, which sort of throws that toe, what's called the toe sweep away, as molds are done with a particular sweep in mind. This is important because a lot of the money in the industry is done with boots, and boots need a particular kind of sweep. Technicians like Clint and feet models like Arlene develop a work dynamic that turns them into a unit. As much as the model knows what are the peculiarities of her feet, the technician knows how to make calculation based on how feet conform and depart from the standard measurement. In this case, experimental information that will be considered quote-unquote noise in other metrological contexts, as they actually relate to the various imperfections of the model in replicating the standard, are incorporated as vital data. The more technicians and models work together, the more designers get used to a particular foot, the more that transform that noise, that little departure in the measurements, into a signal that guides how they produce the standard. Let me explain this more. This is, and I got this with a lot of pride from the feed model. I mean, most feed models tend to have like their initial measurements of when they were quote unquote discovered, usually in Brazil by castings, in China by casting, but also in factory work. A lot of times it's like a Cinderella story of someone that is taken out from very sort of boring, repetitive kind of work into another kind of boring, repetitive work, but better rewarded. So candidates put a fin on the machine, and they're looking for how volume will relate to form on 6 different areas. And I don't know if I'm going to describe all of this, but on top of the length and the width, the ball, the waist, and the instep, what is measured are circumferences between dorsal plantar, the heel, the calf, etc. Career feed models, like I mentioned, talk about the measurement moment and how we call attention to the quote-unquote perfection of their feet whenever you ask them how they ended up doing this for a living. And so you can see, actually, Connie's foot, which is a Chinese feet model, are very close to quote-unquote ideal standards, but even then there's like basically a deviation in each case, which the whole infrastructure gets used to and has to account for. But as much as focusing on measurements give the impression of the fit between feet and standard almost as a miraculous natural occurrence, much like an oracle, models have to bodily train their modeling feet and to eventually become spokespersons for it. The idea is like they at least have to do 1 year of work, because in order once you do that, you go to like every kind of shoe there is, and you know to understand how to talk about a pump versus a boot versus a sandal. They learn to work the instep, the ball, and more importantly, they learn to what technicians call develop a feeling. Part of it is technical, as I said, but part of it is about developing a particular kind of subjectivity, one that can not only comprehend the reaction of its own foot with respect to a particular material, but also the shoe that she's trying is actually not being addressed for her, but is indeed being developed for a consumer very different to her taste and biography. And I love Michael Tausig, in a very different context, had the idea of sympathetic magic to think about this. And I thought, well, this is like a very particular example of sympathetic magic, right? Like you're producing, like looking at, basically sitting, getting like 40, 50 shoes in like every seat in the morning that you do, because in the afternoon your feet are too worn in order to like do the fitting, so they only work in the morning. But they always have to have in mind that the shoe is made for some random American woman, most likely in the East Coast, at least for the brands I had access to. This is sort of how this becomes. That's basically a last. That's what gives volume to a shoe. You get to see that's, well, you didn't see him before. That's Clint. And again, like I explained to a few people, I have a lot of permissions from designers, managers, technicians. Most of the companies don't know I was there. Otherwise, I would have had to like sign all kinds of NDAs, as you imagine. And because of that, a lot of the pictures don't have faces. Like I've been very protective. You get to see hands, you get to see backs. And the only people that told me I want my name, they got that. But in general, I gave the book to read to a couple of designers and said, if anything looks like I'm going to get someone fired, can you please mark it? And I find a way to get it out. Luckily, there wasn't anything apparently, so I was very happy about it. But I think that was a big part. I have like insane amount of photographies, but most of them don't seem to have faces or identifying information. And this is an interesting story. In the case of this tandem, Clint and Arlene, the approved samples had to wear airship twice. The first time when they're doing fitting like before, the second one when they're being confirmed and then sent into production. On the first trip, after having worked with the designer's specification on correcting the shoe, the technician is going to send one half pair to China so the last maker who's there can compare what he's working on with what Clint approved for fitting on the particular foot of Arlene. After China works on it, as he calls it, then a pair of corrected samples come back with the previous fit shoe he had sent. If that works, after trying it on Arlene, and most likely after a few corrections, he sent it back to Donghua in South China as the fit and design approved ones to be then sent to the factory for production. If everything goes perfectly, he finally destroys the first half. He used, and you get to see that there, signed the shoes and marked them with a red dot as to be able to surveil the measurements in that global back and forth. The traffic in designers, technicians, prototypes, and samples is actually dictated by where the fitting models are located and by whether the fit can be matched and coordinated across multiple locations. So you get to see different instances of this all throughout the book and fieldwork. Fit models who are American travel for comfort brands from New York to Donghua because Chinese feet are deemed too delicate for the comfort brands from the US. Sometimes that woman, Anna, and none of these names are real, of course. They're all like pseudonyms, as you can imagine. They have a cutout of her foot to try to work with while in New York. But then I think the most extreme case of this was narrated to me by a former production manager for Clarks who had to coordinate the 5 feet the company had in the world. In London and New York, where the designers were, as well as in Northeast Brazil, Nicaragua, and Donghua, where they had their development and production facilities. His work involved measuring the different feet every 6 months and casting when one of the women needed to be replaced or resigned. In fact, and this was like one of the biggest surprises of doing this field work, one of the major nuisances I observed for those involved in producing reliable standards for shoes has been the agony of replacing a foot that was already fully accounted for within the development infrastructure. So someone who resigns, it is a major trauma, even though this is a relatively, not only a secondary character, but supposedly a relatively subservient one. And then another one of my favorite ones, the trade company in Brazil, basically the wife of the owner was a fit model, which in Brazil is really common that a technician and the fit model end up being a couple, and then if they are lucky, they end up putting together a company. But the wife apparently, the right feet was good for the US market and the left foot for what they call the European market. So she basically did all the coordination for like different brands using one feet or the other. And again, I didn't go into fieldwork knowing or thinking about any of this, by the way. I started doing it as, how is it that designers I don't study the cheapest, but I don't study like the fancy, and I always say Aldo or Nine West because these are 2 brands I actually had not studied. But if you imagine what kind of so it's design has to have leather, but it is mass market, right? And so the question is not just what's in a foot, but what's in a model then. And what we see is they're valued as an object because of their unique physical characteristics, but they have to learn how to be a megaphone for their feet. They have to learn how to be a mannequin. And eventually, and this is the interesting thing, when designers come It's like they regain the idea of the subjectivity because designers tend to ask them how you like them. What do you think of them? Would you wear them? Do they look like our brand? Which are not the questions that technicians do. And in fact, technicians, like I said before, tend to think of their feed models almost like as a Pygmalion kind of subject-object, right? As someone that they're training, but they're training just to reproduce what they like train them to reproduce, not to have like their own voice, right? So it is like an interesting paradoxical kind of case. And like I said, well, she becomes aesthetic subject with her own taste and expertise. And so the question here is, when is it that a part of an ensemble is an agent, and what is it that is an object? And when is it that it replaces other people or nature? And the interesting thing about this particular case is that women who are feed model are both subservient and central to the infrastructure. They're hard to replace, yet tied to the position by their gender, their lower position beforehand in the office and factory structure, their quote-unquote nature of her right foot, and the expertise they have acquired from its possession. Feed models are enrolled to be simultaneously things and at the same time their own megaphones. In being so, the model paradoxically reinforces her thing-like character, becoming just an echo of the technicians with a voice reflected and heard as coming from the speaking foot. But some feed girls who work freelance, who have developed a lot of knowledge, sometimes resist that process of subsumption, developing their own sense of style, their own expertise in finding technical solutions. When they do, they're valued far above the pay of someone considered, quote-unquote, just a foot, while at the same time they're always signaled as moody, capricious, diva-like. And I use all these categories because they point to the fact that in Laturian parlance, these women refuse to be intermediaries, just mere objects that replicate what's being done to them, and instead act as potential mediators. Altering the input and modifying the meaning of the elements they are expected to merely reproduce. So I'm going to jump to the third case, and you might have seen, well, maybe I've seen this because all my friends know I'm working on this project, so I received, luckily, like this article a few times, including by Andrew. But this is beautiful, but it's not how the life of a museum guard operates. If you have not read the story, he's an Egyptian museum guard. There's a current exhibition at the Met that is about how African Americans have imagined Egypt and their relationship to it. And he was commissioned, apparently a curator was walking around and started talking to him and noticed how knowledgeable he was, which tends not to be true for a lot of the guards who are guards. You know, in other institutions, at the Whitney, for instance, I have some New York people here, they actually give you information. Some of them are trained in art, but that's not true of the MoMA, and that's not true of the Met either. But in his case, he's done all these replicas. He's Egyptian, of like particular kind of like Egypt, and apparently they were beautiful. So the curator went to the house or the studio of the guard and saw this, and he was mesmerized. Well, that's not the story I'm going to tell today. And I'm saying this because this is a position that recently has been very much romanticized. If you have not seen this movie about a guard in the Vienna Museum, it's a beautiful movie, by the way. I heavily recommend it. But it starts making you think about how much waiting and invisibility are keys to being a museum guard, right? To being like the person that is there to protect. And then recently, and again, I recommend this one, is a memoir of someone who was a guard, but he was like a very old guard, to be honest. He was a former office person at the New Yorker that decided he wanted to be a museum guard. That's not how it works, at least in New York. If you go at the MoMA or the Met, it's the same people that could be in Social Security. It's the same people that could be giving you parking tickets on the street. These are like good careers for upward mobility into lower middle class, pensions, retirements, health insurance for a particular kind of population. The Met is more diverse, partially because there are many more guards than at the MoMA. The MoMA usually has, I would say there's like 3 big populations depending on age. The older ones are African migrants from Central Africa. So there's like a big Cameroonian, Senegalese component, like of people that are my age and older. Then there's a lot of New Yorkers and some Dominican New Yorkers, which I don't know what's the exact, if they have like something like New Yorkers to call them. So I apologize if there is that word. And then the younger ones tend to be Black or Latino too, entering that, like particular profession. These two books, Coetzee was at the Prado, at the museum in Madrid, as a guest. And he wrote this beautiful story, which again, it's romanticization of what a museum guard is. And so what I'm going to be talking about in the time that I have left, it's going to be about like this. So this is a show at the Baltimore Museum in 2022, which was curated by the guards. They were given the ability to play with things that were already in the collection and organize them like how they liked it, how they wanted, right? And so I'm bringing this to the attention. The next two things are captions, right? That's the word in English, sorry. Thank you. For two different works of art. And this one, as you can see, at the end, what it says, it's talking about stillness, talking about like time not passing, it's very poetic, very beautiful, but I think to me the key is the end, right? Time finds a way to stretch out in total stillness. It's strangely reflective of the experience of being a guard, a job mostly made out of waiting, right? And this is actually so ironic, it was my favorite. I can read it for you if you want me. We are out on our feet all day, guarding the art, it's a tiring work, and I'm always savoring the times when I get to rest my legs. I choose 50 dozen, and I'll show what it is, in part because it's funny for me to think of a chair that would break if you actually sat on it. Like it's a prank on the tired guards. I also have fond memories of seeing visitors of all ages remark on this piece. The Ticonderoga pencil and the plain desk chair, iconic American images. So that's the work of art, right? And then I'm going to start now with like, as you get to see, this is like at the MoMA, and these are guards that are actually not guarding in the sense, that we usually see, but these are like exhibits that are in progress. Well, the favorite work of a guard is getting that one, because it means you actually get to sit for the whole time you have to guard there, right? And also you get to be in actual hiding, not trying to be in hiding from the audience, right? Like a lot of the work of being a guard is becoming wallpaper. It's blending in ways, and I was talking to Andrew before the talk, one thing that is fascinating is you're going to see there's a lot of photography. Some of it is blurred if I don't have the permission. The ones that you get to see fully is because, again, not able to recognize the people. It's really hard to take pictures of them because the moment you're like this, literally, they're like, they think, no, you don't want me. You don't want me on the frame, right? Like you don't want me in the way. You want me just to be basically a wallpaper. So it's kind of fascinating, and it's the same thing. Following them in their routines, like sitting with a notebook, classic ethnographic style in a room, is very easy. They would never think that what you're doing is actually like trying to see what their routines are, right? And one of them told me that one of the things that ended up being exhausting to him is like after hours and hours surrounded by so much beauty, this becomes just like routine, like any other sort of like menial, repetitive kind of job. And so Latour talks about quasi-subjects to talk about an entity that is not fully considered a subject like a human, but still possesses some degree of agency within a network, meaning it can influence and be influenced by other actors, including non-human objects considered quote-unquote quasi-objects within a particular situation. Essentially, blurring the lines between the idea that human subjects are active and objects are passive. But to me, it was interesting because I started thinking, are these guards quasi-subjects or quasi-objects, right? And I'm going to show like the different functions they perform are different kind of furniture, right? So one is being a wallpaper. They're supposed to be everywhere on the background. There's usually replacement rounds going around, so if you need a bathroom break, there's someone coming to cover And this is like constantly happening. Again, you wouldn't notice unless you're following the people, but the idea is like there's never an empty space where a guard should be. So on the one hand, they're like wallpaper. On the other hand, they're like bookends. And I say that because they have to be in particular places where they get to have, sort of a perspective, panopticon-like gaze with respect to the people in there. Sometimes they're just guardians at the gate. They're symbolizing, there's an entrance, for instance, to the new David Geffen wing, and you're going to see always a guard standing there. The guard is not guarding anything. It's like sort of the symbolization of the importance of that particular space. Then I call this a hinge, and I'm going to be showing each and every one of these, so don't worry, as a strategy to escape silence and immobility. Like, in fact, the people that do the replacements are a little bit time envious because they get to be almost more cosmopolitans. They get to know what's going on, and they get to be in constant movement when actually the work of the guard is mostly to be in one place, 2 places at most within like the same room. They also become turnstiles in rooms like capacity, or when you have member-only lines, for instance, to see an exhibition, or information booth. But in order to be an information booth, you know how to give them the instructions. So let's say if somebody says, I'm looking for Klimt. The guard's like, yeah, I'm looking for Rick Branson. What's the idea? But what they would say is like, can you tell me the period and the area? So if you say Central Europe, 1910, they would tell you, 512C, immediately, right? So they are like an information booth, but you need to know how to retrieve the information. So this is like the sort of wallpaper, panopticon gaze bookends, right? And you get to see, and sorry, the ones that I kind of blur a little bit is because you maybe get to see the face of someone. Honestly, I don't think anyone can recognize, but just in case, why not? And as you get to see, first you get to see the exhaustion of waiting, right? Like there's 2 or 3 of the guards, actually. This one was literally sleeping. Like I never seen, I was like the end of the shift. 5:30 the museum closes, 5:15 they start kicking people out. And at that point, you can jump inside like any work of art, and I don't think anyone wants to stop you. It's kind of fascinating to see that. They get together, they abandon their post, etc., but at the same time, So it's an interesting thing because they are placed as if, let's say the exhibit is long, there's going to be, I don't know your name, one where they are, and another, one on the end there, because the idea is to like cover totally with the eye where you are. But that's exhausting. Imagine just being like for 2 hours exactly in that spot looking and whatnot, right? Then this is what I call the hinge. This is what I mentioned before. And I was interested in this one because it's like the tension between sort of more behavioralistic program ways of being. You have to do this, you have to be there. And the fact that there's some subjectivity arising, right? The idea that, you're talking with another fellow guard, you're moving around. And I call it the hinge because it unites the circuit of like the 2 walking guards as they get to encounter each other, right? And in that way, it is like a hinge in the sense of relating the 2 different areas. Usually they're together for a very short period of time, 2 or 3 minutes, and immediately whatever conversation they're having has to dissolve. This work of art, those of you who go to the MoMA might recognize it. By, I think it's David Hammond's. It's entitled, and as you can see, it's like different bits of green tinted bottles in a circular pile of coal. And I put this here because one of my first times going to do field work, I arrived and I saw a mom taking a kid to ask a guard for forgiveness. And I was like, okay, and the kid was like, oh, sir, I'm sorry. And then I asked the woman, I'm sorry, what happened? And she said, well, the kid actually had moved a couple of the coals, which is something that it's a classic joke in a lot of movies about contemporary art, to be honest. Sort of playing, and the guard was furious, and went to talk to her about how rude that was and how after getting... But interesting thing, after getting angry, she went and grabbed her son and brought him to apologize to the guard. And I mentioned this one because I think it's that foundational tension. The guard is supposed to never be seen, it's supposed to be a background object, but then they're supposed to come and tell you how to behave or not behave, right? So it's like, again, like an interesting, to me at least, tension between the two. So one of the functions is to be a sentinel, right? So here the guard is not seen on a first view, yet if you see the second one, wow, this is like, I guess I really covered the face of it. The guard is here sort of making sure, of course, there are lines on the floor for people not to get closer, but they're also there controlling for works of art like Van Gogh, for some of the most popular stuff over there, controlling especially the people coming to take photos, selfies, and whatnot. I don't know if you read the Mona Lisa is getting its own room, partially because of the amount of selfies that people are taking with it. And so you would say, okay, so the guard works as a sentinel. Well, not always, right? And so this work of art was, I think for 1 year, almost exhibited at the lobby of the museum, and it uses artificial intelligence to interpret and transform 200 years of art at MoMA. Basically, they just put every work of art in MoMA in a data, it's probably already in a database, and he played with AI, and all these forms that it was constantly producing, they were different, and there were particular ways of synthesizing, almost like in a hallucinatory way, to be honest, I think. But as you get to see, there's a lot of people with cameras, there's a lot of, un-museum-like behavior, if you believe something like that exists, but there's no guards, right? And so partially that is explained by the quote-unquote immateriality of the work of art. There's nothing that you can do to this. I mean, it's a wall with a screen, if anything. There are sensors, there are camera, there are expert systems too, right? So there's that interesting tension of when there is a sentinel that is a guard, when there's not. And then the other part of this is like the interaction of other objects and the affordances, right? And so this particular work of art seems to be very inviting for people, right? There's something about the multi-layer quality of it, the idea that there's something secretive maybe hiding there, the idea that you can like go and peek. So in the times that in the 26 times that I've gone to do fieldwork so far, it seems to be a hot spot for sort of interaction between guards and people. Is that at the same time, for whatever reason, the guard is relatively far from view and is obstructed horizontally by a wall. And what was interesting to me is how the variability of how much this was enforced depending on the crowd size and the time of the day, right? So they're a sentinel, sometimes they're not, sometimes they are, but they don't enforce it, right? Just to show like the different kinds of tension, sorry. And so I started thinking of this, is this an impossible object, right? On the one hand, there's like behavioralistic model training processes intended to model their behavior so they behave in acceptable ways. But at the same time, you have conflicting emotions, contradictory attitudes, conflicting definitions of self-other, in the sense of trying to think how guards are objects to be controlled, but at the same time, sentient beings who are appropriate partners in interaction, right? And so there's a tension between being invisible and being a sentinel. There's an ambivalence between being just a furniture, right? Either a wallpaper, a seat in some ways, right? Or a bookend. But sometimes, there's a tension between that and the vigilant subject. Sometimes there's vigilance for show. And then there's also what I call escape to subjectivity. Sometimes that means they sing. There's a guard that, like, when he's alone, he's usually by the Matisse swimming pool, which is an isolated room of the MoMA. And so if you walk close, he's always singing, sings beautifully. And then the moment he sees you, he stops, right? And so I ask him, do you always sing? Are you a singer? But in general, people, don't pay attention to it. The different strategies are walking. One of my favorite person, he's someone who actually does the the replacements when people go to the bathroom and coordinates that. And so he's always walking, but so he speaks Spanish, so he's on the cell phone, and he's doing this as he's pretending to give instruction, but he's actually speaking Spanish, saying, no, mi amor, ella no es mi novia, ya te dije. He was talking to a random girlfriend about another woman, probably just hoping nobody understands, what they're talking about, nobody understands what they're saying, so who cares? But that was his strategy to go around and still use the cell phone. I mean, a lot of them use the cell phone even though. And then the other thing that I noticed is they escape towards the different windows the museum has. And so here you get to see all the different kinds. And this, you would say, well, there's no window here. This is if you enter after the atrium, you go to the right, you go all the way to the end of the contemporary art. This actually, if you open it, the street is outside, which I didn't know. And so some of the times in the summer, what I've seen is a guard like this, just open get some actual air from the outside and come back in. Right? Again, it is so on the corner of a huge room, it is so separated that it's not something that people see, partially again because there's supposed to be a wallpaper, so who cares about seeing this, right? And then in that sort of what I call finding the light, this guy was hilarious because it was towards the end of a day, and like I said, people tend to relax their behavior. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Julio Iglesias. Yes, I know. I saw you, so I know you are. So he was singing Me Olvidé de Vivir, but in French. And I was mesmerized because I didn't know. You know that Julio Iglesias recorded in English, in French, probably in languages I have no idea that he recorded. And so I went and asked him. And the moment I asked him and recognized the song, he kept singing even more. And I was with a friend of mine who's a professor at the New School, and he started singing to her, which I thought was really funny. And so, again, these are particular ways in which subjectivity is activated in different ways in interaction. And so, I'm going to, 57 minutes, pretty good. This case on the idea that these are backgrounding subjects, right? Being reduced to an object is what allows guards to occupy the subject position they're invited to occupy, actually, right? There's a tension between background and visibility. There's a tension between stillness and movement. And again, I'm not big on discussion conclusion. It's more hopefully a conversation with you guys. But I was interested in thinking, in this talk and doing once again the idea of humans as subjects and things are objects on the other, but thinking how different art worlds have different aesthetic epistemologies, right? How opera, design, art, museums, if you compare them, we get to see different kinds of passages between subjects and objects under the different conditions of these social worlds, right? Which kind of help us to better see what then is subjectivity in that creative sphere, right? So object-subject is depending on its position, how meaning is constructed within a particular art world. In the case of the model, positions that are subject and object at the same time, right? The museum guard who is reduced to an object, and that reduction is necessary to occupy and perform the subject position assigned to them. And in doing that, I was, trying to see the kind of variation that you can find in being a quasi-object or being a quasi-subject, right? The kind of variation that you find in trajectories of when and how are you a subject, when and how are you an object. The role that affective coloring has in this, right? Weight and invisibility appear both for the fit model and the guard as key parts. And, if you study domination, the temporality is a key dimension. Those who wait, right, tends to be those in the lower echelons of society, those in the welfare office, right, those in waitings in offices in airports and whatnot. Also to think of the fact that even though when we grab a monist ontology in which we dissolve ideas of subject and object, we kind of lose a little bit that most people tend to have self-concepts of who they are, right? And they would like some congruence between who they think they are and how they participate in a particular network as actants, right? And so in this case, it's that tension between being an intermediary, being just something that reproduces and participates what's before in the network, or being a mediator, somebody that produces effects. And I hope to have sort of shown in that return to the warrant of the talk who and what counts as a subject. Thank you very much. Oh, nice.
Just speak into the mic so we can continue to record our event. So just raise your hand and a mic will arrive.
Thank you for this excellent lecture. My name is Henry Gromlich, and as I was looking at the topic around museum curators and guards, have you studied differences in culture between different nations? Just returned from Paris, and small museums there had much less rigorous guarding than most museums you would find in the United States. And it opens up then, I think, to the question of subject and object as the museum goer. Who is the museum goer? Do they have complete agency? Or do they leave a certain amount of agency once they enter the museum and become a role of the person that is consuming culture?
Thank you so much. So, like I mentioned, I started this ethnography relatively recent, so I wish I had, I've done comparative work in the sense that I travel and I do exactly the same thing that you do. And so, but I think there's two things that are key in what you say. One is sort of like the particular lore of the museum. So I was mentioning New York, there's also a big range of variation. The Whitney has a mixture between guards and people that give information. There's a really beautiful ethnography of the Hermitage Museum that shows how much actually the guards are kind of the people that keep the history of the museum in an interesting way. So there is like a lore and a kind of knowledge that is much like the Opera Fan. It's expert in a very particular way. It's less academic than our knowledge. It's very encyclopedic and at the same time not that much, not super systematic. So I would say that's the comparison. The second thing is, my idea for this project is to have a second part where I get to interview the guards in their home, partially to see if they're taking anything from the museum with them, like if they have in the fridge cards from their favorite exhibits, and also to talk about what they think about the people that go for us, because it's true. There are people that go that enjoy it. There are people that go like they go to the opera because it is a particular experience. I mean, I go, and one thing that is funny too is I don't get noticed because there are so many people that go like almost every day, especially like senior retired people that enjoy going to the museum. They're there every day, so like to see someone that goes once a week for like 3 hours, like it's not the guards are like, catch him, like you're just like a random entity to them, But I'm super curious to see how they see, what they think about the work of art and what they think of the people that go there, right? But I agree with you, a key part of the people going is sort of the tourist gaze, and what they're trying to do here is to background themselves, right? To allow the selfie, to allow the particular moment. Hopefully that makes sense. No, thank you. It's a great question. Oh, sorry.
Follow up the same question. How much input does that guard have, and have you analyzed that so that he becomes more or less of an object and more of an active player in the protection of the art? Is the guard that, is there feedback given? Is it given an opportunity to change the style of protection, the movement around, so that the guard has some input into his own job.
Yeah. There's, again, like a lot of variation. They are trained to follow, like, supposedly like a very strict routine. If you are interested, it's fascinating. The MoMA 3-4, when I was starting with this project, did a series of podcasts of the guards talking about their favorite work of art. And so you get to see, there's a very small percentage that are also art lovers and connoisseurs. They're very easy to identify. There are 3 guards that I know, and like they're just expecting you to say something like, where can I see? And they immediately, it's like, oh, why are you interested in that? You know about, that's actually a pentimento and the history of pentimento. And you're like, okay, what's going on here? From what I've seen, a lot of it is informal routines. There are, like any other kind of work like this, like custodial, of exchanging routines between different guards, right? Like, okay, so today I have to do this particular 3 rooms. Can I switch this with you? And then the questions that you hear when they're talking is, how much people go there? Like, am I gonna have to move a lot? Like, is that, like a worse kind of task than the one I have at hand? And like I said, most people envy, and this is like a higher status guard, the guard that moves around to do a replacement, partially because, well, they get to move around. They get to, if anything, be more cosmopolitan because they're talking to far many more other guards and people from the audience and whatnot. So I think there's that. I mean, the training, I haven't been able to see it. Like I reproduce it from memoirs of museum guards. Seems to be very standard, but also very minimal. And it is a set of behavioral prescriptions of what to do, what to tell, where to stand, things like that. Then there seems to be a little bit of openness. And what I noticed, and that's why like the sociology of work is interesting for this, is like has become like many other things in New York, like an ethnic niche, right? Like where particular people tell their friends, hey, you can work doing this. They pay like relatively okay. They give you all this. And so I would say the moments they really enjoy is when they get, for instance, to talk to French in one another or to talk in Spanish, right, like to one another. And so you get to see that kind of attempt to like be close to someone that you can take a break for 3 minutes while you're working, though, and have a conversation, let's say, in French. I don't know if, again, this in comparison, the other 2 projects I spent 6 and 7 years of my life doing. So these 25 visits is the beginning of something, but hopefully in the future I'll have better answers for this. But now I'm thinking out loud with you, if that makes sense. And what was your name? Sorry. Cosmo. Okay. Julia, ¿no era? Oh, ya te cambié el Javiera, mira, te maté. A fellow Argentinian. Sorry.
Yes. Thank you, Claudio. I have 2 questions. One is if you could reflect a little bit on the difference between doing and saying. So I was reminded in some of the scenes you showed of state officials that I interviewed many years ago who would describe themselves as the net on a tennis court or the lines on a football pitch, soccer pitch. And, and I very crudely just analyze that, like, how they would make themselves saying, like, I am the rules, right? So they would say those phrases to make themselves out to be these rules, which they conceived of as neutral. So, if saying versus doing, because you've shown us 3 cases of action, right? And so I'm just curious about that. And then could you also say a little bit more about how you are defining and conceptualizing subjecthood?
Yeah.
As I mentioned when I came in, I've been working on it and thinking about it, I'll admit kind of reluctantly because I'm also a sort of an empiricist because I've been writing about rights of nature. And when you talk about rights of nature, you admit it's subjecthood in this very legal sense. And you've been able to sort of avoid all of those debates. But what is the difference here between subjecthood, humanity, individuality? Can you walk us through that a little bit? Yeah.
Thank you. I mean, with the first one, again, like I mentioned, haven't been able to do. So, I mean, you got to see, for instance, in the Opera project, you got to see a lot of testimonies, but these are all testimonies after like 18 months of fieldwork seeing people. But at some point, you just observe people, especially in an opera house where you're supposed to be silent and doing things, and you can impute meaning to what they do publicly, but at some point you have to kind of ask them, what do you think you're doing? Same thing with I would say with the second project. In the second project, I would say things were tighter there in terms of the feed, because a lot of the people that work in the shoe industry, the first thing, and I think that's why I got so much entrance into it, is, if you tell them I want to work on exploitation, they're like, yeah, whatever, like I don't care. But if the first thing they tell you, shoes are made by a lot of people working together around the world in different ways, and you tell them, oh, I need to understand that, then it's very different how you enter. They feel like you're almost a collaborator in the process of figuring that out. Also, in the first two cases, and that's where maybe the guard might be the same, but I just don't know because I haven't talked to them in such a systematic way. The opera fan, the shoe technician, the fit model, they're all like different craft people who love their craft. And one of the interesting things about shoes, and again, these are things that I figured out as I was doing the project, is it's one of the most interesting industries because you have like a two-speed for it, in the sense that like the margins are very little, very small, so you're always on the lookout for cheap labor. At the same time, you need like a modicum of expert knowledge close to that, right? And so, for instance, when I did the fieldwork in Donghua, that part of China was actually, it used to make 80% of the leather shoes exported to the US by late 2000s. But when I started doing fieldwork and when I finished in 2017-18, it was just 25%. A lot of it had moved inner in parts of China, but the expert knowledge kept at Donghua because you have like this, you can go on a mission, quote unquote, it was almost like colonial classic story of like, can I replicate this? Is this person gonna turn against me, steal my designs, steal my things, or I have like a person that controls it? And afterwards, as production now is in Myanmar, Philippines, Vietnam, the new command and control, the cluster center is Ho Chi Minh City, where the sneaker industry, right? And so it's always like a, knowledge that becomes, and Harvey actually knows a lot about this in general, becomes like a particular center for action, but then the factories keep moving, and the question is what's, right, like close to that. So when you meet the Taiwanese and the Brazilians, they're really proud of their craft. They come from families that done this, and so they want to talk to you about this. That's like a classic thing with ethnography that people are like so scared of, doing this to a person. I'm like, how few people actually ask about their life stories by anyone, not even their partners? So if you go and you tell them, how did you end up here in China? Well, they're like, come Sunday. We're doing a huge barbecue with like every Brazilian technician in town. I'll introduce you. No, this is exactly how the fieldwork work, right? And the Taiwan is the same thing, because they are families that have been doing this for 40, 50, 60 years, so they want to tell you the story. The opera fan, whose family, they find him unbearable, their co-workers find them like exhausting, and you all of a sudden want to go to their house so they can talk your ear off for 4 hours about their opera life. Who would say no to that, right? And so I'm curious about whether the guards in this saying, doing thing, how much they're going to say, actually, I love this. I don't know why you think this as wallpaper. Like, I enjoy, and again, there's 2 or 3 guards that are very obvious that they enjoy. There's others that I talk to that have been guards as part of their career. So before they were at Intrepid, like the air carrier that is locked, like on the water in the Hudson, right? And so they went from there to the moment when I asked them what's better, they say this one was more fun because there were different people, but they didn't say anything about the artwork versus the military paraphernalia, right? So I don't have a proper answer for the third one, but I'm hoping to see if there's that tension. And then when it comes to, one of the interesting things for me was subject is a much more charged political theory way of thinking about this, and also psychoanalytical one, right? Because like a subject is not always like an individual, right? It could be a collective, it could be a thing, and so I was, going, and that's why Rancière was there at the beginning, like thinking, well, really, a subject is someone relatively autonomous, that can talk, that things that are like in process of decision making. At the same time, a subject is someone that is subject to, and hence like the opera fanatic / addict, and is someone, that in that sense is limited, and their options because of that, of enunciation of where they speak from, you're tied to what makes you a subject, right? In a very sort of psychoanalytical way, if you wish. So that's how I've been thinking of that. But I think, and humanity, and I think that's an interesting tension, right? Because one of the, the saying and doing, self-subject, object-subject, they're all like sort of tragic categories, dualisms, and we're all like, enough of dualism. And then yet, like I mentioned before, humans are things with self-concepts that want some version of congruence between who they are, what they do, and how they make a story of it, right? And so I'm curious to how to think of that, if you wish, post all the dissolution of the distinction between the two, if that makes sense. Hopefully I answered kind of,
Hi, hola.
¿Cómo era el nombre?
Leo Cabranes. Thank you for this this wonderful lecture. I mean, I will never go to a museum the same way again. I would like to go back to the opera thing for a second, because you made a remark that caught my attention about that the attraction being less based in on the orchestra, and I was wondering, I mean, in your approach to opera, which is the role, for example, of the conductor? Because many opera people like a particular conductor more than other, and also designers. And I mean, there is so much going on in an opera presentation that is not necessarily only the singer, although, of course, that's the priority. So I wonder if you have anything to say about all these mediators that surround the singer.
Yeah. So, funny story. My father is a symphony conductor, and my brother is a contemporary music composer. So I've been in that world as the black sheep in one way or another for a long, long time. But it's true. No, for sure. Like, and again, that was another thing. I would say, the interesting thing is people would go for a conductor, but they would appreciate what they do with the musicality when it comes to the voice. And to me, that was always, the tension that was always interesting was that, and you would hear like in the beginning of an applause or something, the instrumental parts alone are always considered secondary to the singing part. And so the conductor, and you can see it even more in the ballet. In the ballet, the conductor deforms the music, basically, because if you're waiting for someone to land, right? Like you have to wait for that, and so the music has, and so there's an interesting tension, for instance, in ballet that is different in opera, which is the conductor usually thinks, I'm going to do Stravinsky the way Stravinsky it's supposed to be done, and the dancers are like, respect the times. I can make it that fast, or I can make it that slow, right? One way or the other. With opera, I think there's something of the timing, right? Like the tempo that you're taking, but there's also something of like, are they covering, right? Like the voice of the singer. Do they know, like if their voice is not enough for whatever reason to like, have that tutti moment and lower the volume and leave it down so you can still hear the voice. And so I would say the connoisseur appreciates that, where the conductor is still as subservient to the idea that the most important part of the opera is the singing voice. But I agree with you with the designers, but the interesting thing about Buenos Aires, and that's the part where you could say, oh, these are great people and it's so fun, they know so much, they love it. Yeah, but they love it in a very restrictive way, right? Where the object of their love is like being affected, altered, touched, disfigured, right? And so the designers they appreciate are usually not the ones, let's say, that the Met now is trying to attract non-opera goers, younger people, like do theater, movie directors doing like regie and things like that. And then what's interesting that ends up happening is the new people go maybe once or twice, right? In the same way they could go to Blue Note to see jazz, in the same way that they could go, to all kinds of other interesting experiences in New York, but the old guard disappears, right? And in the Cologne, you can see that, like the moments in which you try to, at the same time, this is very secondary, there's a parallel circuit in Argentina, in Buenos Aires especially, of opera now. And a lot of the people that participate in that are people that don't get to participate in El Colón because El Colón is an international theater, et cetera, et cetera. And so the local scene is huge. And then when you go up, a lot of the times, the people who are there are maybe someone that sings in the choir at the secondary production, right? And so there's that interesting, tension there between performers and audience. And that circuit has exploded the last 20 years. Like Buenos Aires, like 4 opera companies, when historically only, had like one big one. Anyway, I don't know if I dance around everything, but I hope to have answered. Okay, por favor.
I invite everybody to continue the conversation in our reception.
Oh, nice.
Reception, which is right in there.
Oh, fancy.
Before we all join for some wine and snacks.
Oh, thank you.